Well, good morning, church. So good to be together today. And for those who are online, it's 18 degrees outside, so you might want to stay inside. But Chris, really good to see you. Been praying for you and so glad to see both of you are healthy and here with us today. And I hope Carter's doing good too. This COVID's really done a number on us and on our community, and I'm looking forward to the day that we can have everything open and everybody's vaccinated, and I think that day will come sooner than later, and so I'm very happy that we are here and that our numbers are starting to pick up. Do you know what temptation is? And temptation is to entice. So when you look at the advertisements on your TVs, they try to go through at least 7 different things to make sure that advertisement is going to meet what it needs to do. And that is to entice you, to make sure that you believe that without these Dorito chips, you're just not going to be happy. And it's very successful. I dare say on Super Bowl Sunday, a lot of people are going to be eating Dorito chips. And that's because the Super Bowl Sunday advertisements are so good. I've got pictures with most of them there. The last one I thought, well, you don't need to come to a place where you're going to be tempted. This is a place where we can relax, where we can feel God's holy presence, and we can get away from the world. But what I want you to know is this is real, and in the world, by following the world's agenda, you're never going to find happiness. So if you don't believe God is real, that's okay. The devil has got you as a believer. If you don't believe the devil is real, that's okay. He's really got you because that's all he needs. But he's real, and he's got minions working day and night to make sure we are not going to find happiness. We live in a broken world. So the only way we're ever going to find happiness is if we learn that the battle belongs to the Lord, and if we can learn to overcome that battle. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, and so on. So you'll see it right over there. And if you turn into Matthew chapter 4, we're going to do a lot more than just look at Matthew chapter 4 today. So you might want to be ready to turn a little bit. When it comes to the temptations, what we have is a parallel from Israel coming out of Egypt into the wilderness for 40 years and then into the promised land. In order for them to come out of Egypt, we need to understand how they got to Egypt to begin with. And if you want to know how they got to Egypt to begin with, you need to look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. And you'll see that there's a guy by the name of Joseph that is dreaming a dream that says, you're going to have to go to Egypt. Now, Chris, what does that sound like, right? Joseph, dream, Egypt, right? You get the parallel. There's a lot of parallels. The first Adam came into this world, and he couldn't conquer sin. He couldn't conquer temptation. The second Adam came in the form of Jesus Christ, and he said, this is how you conquer sin. So in order to get out of Egypt, Joseph had another dream, and so that eventually took them out of Egypt. And in this Matthew chapter 2, Joseph has another dream, and that brings them out of Egypt back into Galilee, where Jesus would set up shop in Capernaum eventually, which is really, really nice. It's much, much more pretty than Nazareth. And so you can see why Jesus made his ministry shift to Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee as well. Well, in order for them to get out of Egypt, they had to go through the sea, or the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, is called the baptism of Moses. So you've looked at chapter 2, verse 13 of Matthew. Now look at chapter 3, verse 13. And look what is happening in chapter 3, verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. And Jordan says, I don't think this is going to happen. And Paul, Jesus kind of saying to him, hey, let this one go. Let's do this one, right? But it's so that all things can be fulfilled and so on. And so Jesus is baptized. Now look at chapter 3, verse 17. God speaks from heaven and he says, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, right? That's how chapter 3 ends. What happens with chapter 4? And that, by the way, that is where everything took place. There's the wilderness, there's the Mount of Temptation, there's the pinnacle, and we'll look at those things in just a little while. Then, chapter 4, verse 1 says, then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness. What's going on there? It's immediately after God has said, you are my son, and I am very well pleased with you. Can you imagine any one of us right now? And I think he is. You are my children, and I'm very happy with you all. And so we hear this voice, and immediately after he hears this voice, temptation is going to start. But again, we need to get some more background, and Robert has given us some background. If you have some time after church, please read his article. Both Daryl's article, really, really good article. Thank you, Daryl, fantastic. Robert, and then we have Steve also on how we can help each other as a body. They're very, very good, and they're all essential to understanding this lesson today. Turn, if you would, to the one that is mentioned in Robert's article, Galatians chapter 5, verse 17. In there, you're going to see that the spirit wages war against the flesh, and the flesh wages war against the spirit. In other words, they combat against each other so that you won't do what you want to do. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, so I have to go back one. All right, there it is. All right, and then we'll read verse 18 as well. So we're looking just before the works of the flesh and the fruit of the spirit, the background to it, verse 17. For the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. How are we going to win this battle? The first battle is going to be our insatiable flesh. It's going to have to do with God providing for you. Remember that. God providing for you. Do you trust that God is providing for you? If you're going to win this battle, you need to know this. That God's Spirit inside of you is waging war against your flesh. And your flesh is waging war against God's Spirit. Now, if you listen to God's Spirit instead of your flesh, it will keep you from doing what you want to do. And in order to do that, you need to walk in the Spirit. Look at verse 18. Chapter 5, verse 18. All right, here we go. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. And then it talks about all the things that are the works of the flesh. Now, turn back, if you would, back to chapter 4, verse 1, and tell me what is happening. You have the Spirit, and you have the flesh, and they're warring. And who is leading Jesus? Church, who's leading Jesus? If you are led by the Spirit, you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. You will fulfill the desires of the Spirit, right? Who is leading him? When we go into temptation, God is not going to desert us. He's going to be with us. We've got to be led by the Spirit into the wilderness. So I want to have a show of hands right now. I'm going to take a poll. And I'm going to ask a question, and the majority of you are not going to hold up your hands. So you're going to win the poll, those who don't vote. But if you can, hold up your hands. How many of you believe that Jesus cannot sin? Or Jesus could not sin? Anybody? All right? Okay, several. Okay, now let's take another poll. How many of you believe that Jesus could sin? Let's see that. Okay, quite a few of you, right? 50-50. Well, here's the good news. You're all right. As fully God, he couldn't sin. As fully man, he could sin. And to make it easy for you to understand, I want you to think of the person that you love the most in the whole wide world. I want you to think about that person. Everybody got somebody you really love, right? You got that? Could you murder that person? That shocked you, didn't it? Shocked you, right? Some of you are nudging your partners. You say, yes, I could. That was funny. Some quick wit over here. All right, so the truth is, my flesh, I could. But my spirit, absolutely, I would never do it. You get that? As fully God, walking fully in the Spirit, you cannot sin. You cannot do the things of the flesh. And that is it's as simple as that. That's what we got to get. And it's going to work on three areas. It's going to work on your provisions, your protection, and God's promises. So we're looking now at the provisions of God. Jesus has been in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, here's another Bible Bowl question. How many years was the Israelites in the wilderness? How many years? 40. You see the parallels? So he's there 40 days in the wilderness. And at first, when you start a fast, you're very hungry. But not hungry to starving. Then your body gets used to it. And when your body starts getting used to it, you're not hungry anymore. And your body starts to use the fat that you have inside of you. And it starts to feed off the fat. But there will come a time in that fast when your body's going to return to being hungry. And when that happens, you're starving. So in the prayer, Bill, you were talking about social, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Okay? And I think the only one you left out was social, because that's what we're doing over here. But when we are socially weak, spiritually weak, physically weak, mentally weak, when we are weak in those areas, guess what the devil does? He shows up. All right? So let's look at our text here. It says, and he was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Matthew, that's a little bit of an understatement here. He's starving, okay? He's very hungry. And the tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, and in his ears he's still ringing, you are my son. You are my child. You are a child of God. With you I'm well pleased. Look at Colossians 3 sometime if you need to know that. You are God's child, and God really loves you. If you are the Son of God. Some people will say it could be since, but I'm going to take this translation. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. And so what we have here is Satan is trying to see if Jesus would look towards him for provision. Now look, if you are God the Son, then you can split your will from God the Father, and you can act independently, and people will think you're so fantastic, right? That's what he's saying. But in John chapter 5, verse 19, John chapter 5, verse 30, John chapter 12, verse 49, and many places in the Bible, Jesus says, I cannot do anything but what the Father tells me to do. I don't say one thing that he doesn't tell me to say. I don't do one thing. I just don't do that. Whatever he tells me to say or do, that is what I will say and do. Repeatedly he says that, because that is where the battle is won. When our will is 100% tied with God's will. So Jesus answered him, it is written that man shall not live by bread alone. Okay? So whatever your sin is, whatever you struggle with, whatever provision that you're looking to the devil to give because he's telling you you need Doritos to be happy, whatever it is, I don't know what your Doritos is, but you need to put that in, and you need to know the Word of God to be able to say this, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So we suffer from something called fear of missing out, FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And the TV tells us, and the advertisements tell us, you're missing out on life, and you need this, and it's getting us to focus away, not on all that we have, but the one thing we don't have. We're so scared of missing out. And so then we start to make mistakes. So I want to show you a little bit on how this works. And by the way, what was happening here is all the scriptures Jesus uses to defend himself are from Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy was a sermon series that Moses delivered just before going into the promised land. And he's going to counter these. So, and you can see these reflections in Exodus, because this Deuteronomy is Deuteronomos, the second reading of the law, and it's just a repetition of what happened in Exodus. But what happened here is they didn't have bread. So they're complaining and grumbling, and they say, in Egypt we had meat and we had bread, and why did you bring us out of Egypt? We were so happy to be slaves, right? Why did you bring us into salvation? We were so happy when we were just sinners, basically. And the devil will provide whatever we need to, and this is terrible what you've done to us. And so they're complaining. So that's what the first fight really is. But I want to give you one application throughout this lesson, well, for the whole lesson. And this one I was asked specifically by someone to do. And so it has to do with a young man, a young adult maybe, who wants to satisfy the needs of the flesh outside of the bonds of marriage. So what are the scriptures we need to know for that? But every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, right? So here are some scriptures for somebody who believes it's okay to be intimate before marriage, or to live with somebody outside of the bonds of marriage, or whatever. So here they are. The first one is Matthew chapter 5, verses 28 through to verse 32. And that is where Jesus says, don't even look to lust after women, because if you've done that, you've committed adultery already in your heart. It's better for you if your right eye was gouged out and your right arm was cut off, and to enter into heaven maimed, than to have all your members and to enter into hell forever. And then he says, the only reason you can divorce your wife, young man in this case, is if your wife has an affair or commits adultery. So we look at that, we say, wow, that's very tough. Look at our culture today. And people who listen to me say this might say I'm being very judgmental. So Tom, am I being very judgmental or am I reading the Bible? So people basically are judging you because you believe the Bible. That's what's actually happening. So be careful if you judge, lest you be judged, right? That's what it is, tit for tat. That's how it's going to work. So let's go on with the next one. Jesus amplifies it in Matthew chapter 19. Read verse 9. There's an argument about Moses did this, and then Jesus said, yeah, but we're not under Moses' law anymore. Basically, from the beginning, it wasn't so. Jesus says the only reason you can divorce your wife is adultery or fornication. Then the apostles in verse 10 say, but Lord, if this is the case between man and woman, it's better not to get married, right? Wow, this is serious stuff. Then Jesus says, not everybody to whom this is given will receive it. So there's only a few people actually going to hear what Jesus is saying. And then Jesus says something very interesting in verses 12 and 13. He says, this is the part of your body that it's better for you to enter into heaven without. And you're going to have to go and read it because it's pretty graphic, and I don't want to get into this in this audience. But he uses the same word 5 times. And he says, some people do this for the sake of the kingdom. Now, if you want to know how serious it is, John the Baptist told Herod, the king of the day, you shouldn't be married to Herodias because she is Philip, your brother's wife. And he basically lost his head because of that. And that's okay because he became less and Jesus became more and so on. And so that's a sermon that attaches to this, but we don't have time to go right into it. Hebrews chapter 30, verse 4, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, keep the marriage bed holy. Genesis chapter 29, verse 23. Intimacy is equal to marriage. Be very careful. Even if you wake up thinking you married Rachel and in fact you married Leah, what is going to happen? You married, so be careful. You don't want to fool with this stuff. But every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. I'm not going to do this with every point. We're just doing it with the provisions that God gives us. And then the safety valve is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. And talk to Bill if you want to know more about it. He'll tell you it's a very touchy subject. But he had to talk about it on Wednesday in our lesson, our daily devotion. So let's move on. And just again, this is a very good day to talk about temptation, Super Bowl Sunday. If you want to be very healthy, third on the list is kale. You can eat kale tonight, right? And unless you start throwing kale at me, I'm going to keep going. There's always choices, church. There's always churches. There's always choices. All right, so let's go to the next one. This one has to do with protection. The first one had to do with God providing for you. Win that battle. God will provide for you in His time and in His way. Trust Him. I know it's very, very hard. You know, Sariah, you're going to have a child. Abram, you'll be father of many nations. Oh, I don't think so. Hey, listen, Abram, you take my maidservant, Hagar, and you have a child with this young girl, and guess what happens? Ishmael is born, and the Middle East has not stopped having problems to this day, okay? So listen, God's promises are there. You just have to be patient. And so many scriptures we can go over this. But let's go on to the next one. He takes him to a very high point in the holy city in Jerusalem, on the pinnacle of the temple. And you can see how high it is. It's 450 feet. What you see over there is just the base. You take it way up there, high up. Imagine that the building goes way up. And on the right on the top is Solomon's portico or Solomon's porch. And you look down into the bottom of the Kidron Valley. It's 450 feet. And he says, if you will throw yourself down from here, you'll be okay. In other words, you're going to be protected. So this one has to do with protection. This one has to do with days like COVID. It has to do with things like you're going down the highway and there's an icy road and you might slip. Where do you get your protection from, right? Think carefully about this one. Think carefully. So let's just look at the text. He says to him, let me just turn the page here. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple. Now Malachi, one of the last prophecies the Israelites got, was that Jesus would appear. John the Baptist would become the forerunner. He would proclaim that Jesus is going to appear. Jesus, the Messiah, they're talking about the Messiah, would appear, and this is what it's all about. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, that's the Messiah again, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So the devil knows Jesus is thinking this, right? And so he says, all you've got to do is come to the temple, and you're on this high place. Everybody's going to see you. Look at how many people here in Jerusalem. They're looking for the Messiah to come to the temple. And if you cast yourself down there, you'll be okay. You won't get hurt. I was told this morning that little Kylie's not doing too well. She hurt her collarbone right here. And keep her in her prayers. But, Jesus basically, the devil's basically saying, if you fall, you're going to be okay. And so that's not good. So look at what Jesus is going to say in verse 6. And he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. He's quoting Psalm 91. But notice what he left out. Can you all see what he left out? I put it in nice big red bold letters at the bottom. That's what the devil left out. Jesus knows if he stays in the will of the Father, he's going to be okay. If he steps out of the will of the Father, he's not going to be okay. This has to do with protection. It has to do with so much more than just protection. But this is initially what he's really going to try to get. And so whether the devil comes to you walking by foot or comes on a bicycle or whatever, if he wants to argue with you, don't get an argument with him like Eve did. The devil is going to win. He went to the best seminary possible, right? Robert, I think you're still going to talk to us a little bit more in detail about this, but some people believe he could have even attended the heavenly seminary, and he could maybe even have been the worship leader in heaven. We'll have to talk about that later on. But he's had a lifetime to get spiritual knowledge in him. You don't want to argue with him. You want to let God do the arguing. You want to let God provide for you. You want to let God protect you. Jesus said to him, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So what is happening here? The first temptation was about bread, and they were grumbling. Now the temptation is water. And it's stepped up. They're not just grumbling with Moses now. Now they're starting to argue. Now they're starting to get volatile. It's escalating. And so Moses, in Exodus chapter 7, verse 17, he names this place, chapter 17, verse 7, he names the place not just the place of testing, but also the place of quarreling. And so it's very emphatic what is happening here. And again, he has to rely on, Jesus has to rely on God to protect him. And the illustration that I can use here is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even if God doesn't protect me, we're not going to listen to you, O king. Very respectful, but they get thrown to the fiery furnace. The king looks inside there, and he sees a fourth person, like an angel, like the face of God in there, like the Son of God in there. And they come walking out, and they don't even smell like smoke, right? And everybody, even who threw them in, are dead. So you have to rely on Jesus' protection. So many good illustrations about that. And by the way, it was about falling down before an idol, and so that brings us to the next point and the last temptation of Jesus. And this one doesn't have to do with provisions, it doesn't have to do with protection, it has to do with promises. Has Jesus promised that he will take us to be with him eventually after this world is over? Has he made that promise? Yes, he has. And so either we rely on that promise or we take shortcuts. And each one of these, they walk away from fear and they walk towards faith. But it's not easy. I visited with somebody this week. When I started visiting with this person, there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty about the future. And afterwards, there was a beautiful smile because they could see heaven. And that's how we're going to end just now with a song about heaven. So again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and he said to them, all these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. What's he doing? Satan, when Adam and Eve sinned, a real estate transaction took place, and he got ownership of this world. When Jesus went to the cross, according to the promises of God, not shortcutting it, but relying on the promises of God, a real estate transaction was reversed, and Jesus took over the spiritual kingdom. But it was so tempting. Remember this. He's praying and he's saying, Father, if it is possible, take this cup away from me, but not what? Not my will, but thy will be done. It's not easy to rely on the promises of God. It's not easy. But God is doing it, and Jesus is showing us how to do it. He's giving us a template, not to fail, but a template to pass, with the provisions, the protection, and the promises. And Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you will serve." And again, it's from Deuteronomy. And that is where we find Jesus, and we see that the devil leaves him. In Luke chapter 4, a parallel verse to this one will say that the devil left him for a more opportune time. He's going to come back. Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you will serve." And the devil left him, and behold, the angels came and were ministering to him. And so again, Jesus knows that God will deliver on his promises, but in his way and on his time. And church, can you trust that? Can you trust that? The last thing I want to tell you is about a young mother who had a whole bunch of children, taking care of all these children. Boy, it was complicated. And so she has this list over here, and I don't know if you can read that there. It's pretty good. So look at the number 1 through 10. Look at all the struggles that she has. And by the way, this looks like page 77. So there's a whole lot she's writing off. She's really journaling to get through this. And she says they wake up early. The house is dirty. There's always laundry that has to be done. There's excess dishes to be washed. There's crumbs all over the place. There's groceries that have to be bought. Tables, toilets need to be cleaned. There's a lot of noise always. There's endless questions, right, children? Endless questions. And when I get to bed, I'm sore and I'm tired. But you know what she does? Next to each one of these, she writes a blessing. Isn't that great? So here is what I want to leave you with. Whatever you focus on is going to expand. So what the devil is doing through advertisements, through the halftime show, whatever you want to call it, he's trying to make you not feel happy. Trying to take your peace and your joy so that you won't be content. And if you focus on the one thing you don't have, he's got you. Look at what you do have. And if you're really struggling to focus on this. Look at the beautiful heaven that we have. Today is Super Bowl Sunday. It's a hard day to talk about temptation. I don't like to talk about the devil, but you need to know your enemy. You need to know how he works. Now that you know how he works, rely on God's protection, rely on God's provision, rely on God's promises, and you will be okay. If you're subject to the gospel invitation, if you need to come forward to be baptized today or to ask the prayers of the church, whatever your need is, please come forward right now as together we stand and sing.